You're listening to the Final Say Radio Show, a Rappaport Media production, with your host Brett Rappaport and co-host John Rappaport.
Without further ado, I want to welcome our first guest of the program today to the Final Say Radio Show, Daniel R. Simmons, who is the Director of Regulatory and State Affairs with AEA, which is the American Energy Alliance. Dan, if you could just for our listeners give a brief background as to what the American Energy Alliance is and what you guys are working on, that would be a great start.
Sure thing. The American Energy Alliance, we're based in Washington, D.C., and we are a free market advocacy organization. We promote freer markets in energy. We don't support subsidies for any form of energy, whether it's for oil or natural gas or wind or solar. But what we want is that is for people to make their own energy decisions instead of having the government make it for them.
Okay, now that's fair enough. And now we've read some of the articles and things that you guys have put out there and some of the press releases, and I suppose it's that time of the year where they're discussing subsidies and things that are going to be included in what we're going to fund. And, of course, I think you guys have some opinions on the subsidies, and in particular the type of lobbying that goes on, and including the idea of wasteful spending of taxpayer dollars. So I'll let you give us a little insight into that.
Oh, sure thing. Every year, one of the funny things that happen in Washington is there is a package usually passed at the end of the year called the Tax Extenders Package that has a whole bunch of special tax provisions and special set-asides for energy, but for also a lot of other things. And everything in the kitchen sink gets thrown in. The last time that it was extended, you had things getting thrown in at the 11th hour that had never been debated in the House of Representatives, for example, like the wind production tax credit, which is something we don't support. That is wind producers get a subsidy for every a substantial subsidy for every megawatt hour of electricity they produce, regardless of whether or not that it is needed or the value. So that's just like one example of these subsidies and special tax provisions that we work hard to try to get Congress to get rid of.
Now, Dan, you have a background in both economics and law, so do you take more of an issue with this from a perspective of the economic viability, not necessarily having the free markets to make the appropriate decision, or is it more of the fact that the government is ramming yet another technology that we can argue is still in an adolescent stage on the public, whether or not the public is ready to absorb it, and without necessarily having a full and fair research on the potential negatives of these technologies, because they're sold as green, but as you know, there are many negative sides to wind technology that gets very little play in the media.
Sure, that's true. Our take is that, look, the energy has even in energy sources that we've been using for more than 100 years, and we've been actually using wind to generate electricity for more than 100 years. We've been using oil for more than 100 years. We've been using coal for more than 100 years. Like, even though we've been using these technologies for a long time, there is the potential for the market to change very rapidly and to radically change how we look at our sources of energy. In the last 5 years, our oil production has increased nearly 40%. Our natural gas production has increased 25% in only 5 years, and that has to do with hydraulic fracturing and the hydraulic fracturing revolution. So what our point is, particularly with wind, is, hey, let's let the market work here. The market's going to sort things out. It will figure out the most efficient, the most cost-effective way to generate electricity. And you know what? In 5 years, the world could be completely different. But if we are reliant on subsidies and thinking that we already know the answer, we might not get to where we really want to go. And, if we would have known 5-6 years ago that the hydraulic fracturing revolution would come along and we would suddenly be generating or producing a lot more oil and natural gas, that would have really surprised people. Back in the mid-2000s, all the talk was about importing natural gas, and now we're talking about exporting it. So there's the potential for radical change in energy markets. So let's let that radical change happen instead of trying to dictate it from Washington.
Now, Dan, there's two different areas here that I wanted to touch on with you, because let's put on our devil's advocate hat and think about what the critics will say, right? They will say all the fossil fuels are horrible and they're wreaking havoc on the environment. Polar bears are dying every time you turn on your air conditioning, et cetera. But the reality is there are environmental downsides to wind. So what are both the leading environmental downsides that concern you about wind, and what are some of the economic concerns that Americans should have about wind and they may not be aware of? There are clearly some very significant hidden costs in wind, such pertaining to the location of that wind, how you transport that energy, et cetera.
Sure thing. The biggest kind of environmental cost with wind is the wind turbines kill birds and bats. Bats aren't exactly creatures that get a lot of they're not cuddly and cute, so people don't care as much. But wind turbines kill a lot of bats, and bats are important for ecosystems. Also, the wind turbines kill over 100,000 birds a year, and that is that is sad. And the reality is that it isn't like that that wind turbines are an unmitigated bad. They're not. Like anything else, like anything we do in life, there are costs and benefits. So let's just make sure that we look at both the costs and the benefits. And those are some of the environmental costs that don't get a lot of play, as you mentioned. And then on the economic side, the biggest problem with wind is just electricity generation generally. In that we want electricity 24/7, 365. We cannot. It is incredibly expensive to store electricity on a grid scale. That electricity generation needs to meet electricity demand. And the thing is that electricity demand changes throughout the day. Right now, it is it's a pretty warm day. That means that demand has been increasing throughout the day. And it's not a windy day. That's just reality. The wind doesn't blow when you need the electricity most. And so that's why wind is just not a valuable source of electricity generation. There's nothing wrong with wind, but because it doesn't generate electricity when you need it most, that means that you have to have other sources of generation ready to go, and that just increases costs overall. So that's essentially the economic problems that we have with wind as well.
Yeah, I'm glad you bring that up, because as somebody who spent many years in the energy industry, one of the big problems that I have with wind in let's call it the politicized reliance on wind, is that you have to maintain all of that infrastructure anyway, including those coal and other baseload plants, because when the wind is not blowing, as you said, you can't efficiently and effectively store this energy, and so you have to have those backups anyway. And if those backups are not being used with some regularity, then the overall cost and efficiency and operational challenges are enormous. The other thing that I think a lot of people overlook is the fact that these giant wind farms, to deliver wind efficiently and effectively, and since most people have a NIMBY, not in my backyard mentality, you need enormous transmission line infrastructure costs. And where do those transmission lines often go? Right through the middle of forest that we'd love to keep undisturbed to protect those animals. So I wanted to make sure we got that in. I have a very specific question, Dan, that actually tied into Brett's opening commentary, which you may or may not have heard. And I, for one, am also a free market economics guy. I'd like the markets to figure these things out. I trust the market's ability to apply capital much more efficiently and with much greater reason and logic and evaluation than the government. But there's another big problem that I believe we have here, which is the research side. It appears to me from almost all of my experience in and around this issue and others that it's very difficult for us to have intellectual honesty in the research, because so much of the research seems to be highly politically motivated and paid for by people who, what I like to refer to as support outcome-based, politically oriented research. So I wanted to get your sense of whether or not you've actually seen good quality supporting research, either that either supports or should go against the use of wind as a major base load, even if the technology would support it, form of energy in this country?
That's a good question, and it is a challenge. One of the things that we try to do at the American Energy Alliance is to rely on information from the Energy Information Administration, which is a part of the Department of Energy, and if you know where to look, there's plenty of good information that says, hey, look, wind is very costly. But the point is that you need to you need to look, and then there's still challenges. So what I'm saying is that there is information out there, but the wind industry, the wind lobby, their entire business model is predicated on continuing with the wind production tax credit, which means that they will spend millions of dollars a year to continue the tax credit, and that includes studies that support their view. But I'm really, when it comes to research about wind and about electricity generation, I'm not too concerned about that there is a preponderance of studies that are maybe shady studies or something that say that wind is that wind is necessarily better than it is, just because they're very easy to recognize, and that there is a simple reality: wind is expensive, period, and two, wind doesn't blow all the time. And when people realize that, coupled with the fact that we need an electricity grid that produces electricity at all times to meet demand, people see that wind is challenging. And there's no real, every once in a while there's a paper that comes out that says that wind and solar can, fuel can produce all the power in the grid by 2030, but they don't say that they can do it today. Because it just is not even within the realms of reality. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it sure does. And I just want to bring up a few other points in our conversation here, Dan. And I sit on the zoning board of my town, and we quite often have to discuss the idea of adding new infrastructure for cell phone companies. They want to put up more towers or even smaller pieces. But it's always a conversation of, well, where are we going to locate these? Because nobody wants it in their backyard. Nobody wants it in the public parks. There's certain areas that law actually determines can't be located there. So it's a tough question. And, of course, a cell phone is something I think we could all agree everyone wants one. But when it comes to, certain types of energy, you have, everybody wants energy, but there's always the argument of which ones we want to support. And so windmills are substantially larger than any of the cell phone infrastructure that we discuss in other areas. And, even when you look at the average oil well, I would imagine that most of them are a lot smaller than wind towers, and a lot of the things that you're looking at are underground, even a lot of the piping and drilling and whatnot. And so, of course, it's always giving me an argument. So that's one thing. The other thing is that what gets lost in the conversation, I think, as we evaluate energy sources, is the unseen cost, such as if you have electric cars or if you have these massive batteries that you have to make, or the infrastructure that would have to be built out to support new types of systems such as that. But what do you do with car batteries? What do you do with all the wind, the windmills and all the components after they're no longer good? They have to be replaced. How do you go about replacing all these different components when other pieces around it are still in operation? There are a lot of other significant issues that build cost. And so I agree with you. I think that, just to finish, I think that if we just allowed for an absolute free market of ideas and allowed, because I think the market would be different in different parts of the country by region. Like, for instance, the people in California may be willing to pay more for their energy to have it the way they like. I'm sure people in Texas would be more than happy to just stay with oil and natural gas and so on and so forth.
No, and those are very important concerns. The reality of wind is that wind turbines aren't some kind of environmental panacea. You don't look at wind turbines and think, oh my goodness, this is we're suddenly back in nature. No, it's the industrialization of the countryside, and a lot of us think that is unsightly and ugly. And as you mentioned, like when they wear down, they have to be fixed. You have to fix the gearboxes. You need to recycle components, and that's an industrial process. And as you mentioned, just the one statistic I wanted to include. Wind takes up a huge amount of land. If you were to put a study we did a few years ago looked at this place off the coast of North Carolina that they call the Manteo Prospect. They think that with one natural gas platform, you would produce as much energy from that one platform as you would from 59 Cape Wind projects. Cape Wind, obviously, off of Nantucket, where they want to build the Cape Wind project. But 59 different Cape Wind projects, and each one of those is 25 square miles. So we're talking about a massive amount of land to produce the same amount of energy as you can from a single drilling platform. And that's just that we're talking about the industrialization of the countryside or the industrialization offshore. Just because wind is a diffuse energy source, so that's also a challenge. And people don't want it in their backyard. That's one of the things that people don't want oil and gas production in their backyard. People don't want wind either. And in fact, just last week, the people of Ohio banded together to pass new restrictions on wind, so that wind turbines would be farther away from their homes, because wind can be unsightly and can be can cause some kind of health or at least anxiety issues for people that live too close to wind turbines. So it's a concern around the country.
I would imagine they have to be pretty loud as well. But this is the way I evaluate the competition and things of that nature in a free market. One is, and I know John agrees, that quite often when you have these subsidies, it kind of takes away from the idea of free market, and it doesn't allow for the true analytics to be done, whether the markets are actually able to sustain themselves. The other thing, and I think even more important, is to look at our chief competitors and on a global scale. And right now I would call two of the biggest, if not the biggest, to be Russia and China in competing in the energy arena. And they are certainly not going to do everything they can to increase the cost upon their people and go the most expensive route for providing energy. They are going to do what's going to make them the most money as efficiently as possible. So they're going to certainly continue to push for gas and oil pipelines and all the above. And it seems that if we want to compete globally, then the United States has to get off this let's kill fossil fuel thing and build nothing but wind towers.
Well, it is interesting. China actually has the most installed wind capacity in the world, but the United States actually produces the most wind, because a whole bunch of those wind turbines in China are not actually connected to the grid. And it's very interesting to look at what China is actually doing in terms of generating electricity. Here the Obama administration is working very hard to make it difficult to produce electricity from coal. And the Chinese are building, a couple of years ago, they were building a new coal-fired power plant every single week, or at least every other week. So, and their use of coal is just skyrocketing because it produces low-cost, reliable energy, and that's that should really tell us something about where their priorities are. We know what their priorities are. It is producing more electricity to electrify the entire country, and those goals are not shared by the Obama administration.
Sure. Daniel Simmons, one last question before we let you go, and that is, which companies benefit the most from these subsidies?
From there's a whole bunch of wind companies. Ironically, a whole bunch of the largest are not based in the U.S., with Abengoa or Iberdrola, which are based in Spain, Siemens, which is based in Germany. And so it's the large wind developers. Also GE. GE is a very large. They make a lot of the wind turbines. They're based right here. So it's really the turbine developers as well as the owners of the wind of the installations themselves. That's who really benefits.
Well, that makes sense. I mean, that last statement that you said makes sense. It certainly doesn't make sense to be subsidizing foreign companies, and of course, the biggest company or one of the biggest companies in the world, GE, at least in my opinion. Anyway, Daniel R. Simmons, I want to thank you so much for joining us today on the Final Say Radio Show. If you can, for our listeners, please provide your website so they can go find out more and possibly support your organization.
Oh, sure thing. Website's kind of long, but it's AmericanEnergyAlliance.org.
Excellent. Well, Daniel Simmons, thank you again so much, and we look forward to having you back on the program soon.
Sure thing. Thanks for having me.
All right. Have a good afternoon. Bye.